really, you've got a disconnect there between Australian CAD, CAD US. You're basically relying on that correlation between the CAD and the Aussie to give you that sort of hedge. It doesn't. You could say economically, it gives you an approximate result, but fundamentally, it comes back to what they told their investors are going to generate. If they told because investors are investing in resource companies for an exposure to the oil price or the gas price, or if it's a mining company, then whatever the metal is that they're digging up, and they want as pure exposure to that as possible. So if you're a company with those sort of shareholders, then you're seeking to generate a return, in the case of an oil and gas company, as close as possible to the US dollar price of oil and gas. Anything that distracts from that, whether it's Australian dollars or whatever other currency they're dealing around the world, and particularly in terms of capital expenditures, where you've got large and lumpy expenditures, then you're going to seek to hedge that back so that you still are generating as pure as possible US dollar return in oil and gas. So it brings us back to the point of saying, why wouldn't you just hedge the Aussie back to US dollar rather than use this proxy currency of the Canadian, which historically may have been fine, but the reality is you didn't know that when you started the hedging program. Why wouldn't you just use the Aussie rather than the CAD, apart from the practical ease of using existing lines that you've got with Canadian banks to do the hedging program? And from what you've told me, my suspicion is that's the underlying reason for why they've done this.
Your experience with hedging for USD AUD, particularly for 100 million, that's really not that much of a problem. The market, you said before, were very deep, so there should be no problems at all.
No problem at all in doing 100 million.
Yeah.
None, particularly over 12 months. None at all.
If I just add another part of the jigsaw in and say that the oil and gas explorer raises the oil here in Australia and then uses the head entity as the marketing entity, right?
Yep.
So the entity, actual fact, sells on behalf of the subsidiary. Does that also make your perception a little bit, or an observation that, well, they're only hedging Canadian USD, the actual head entity is doing the marketing and selling of the product. There is obviously transactions to and forth between the subsidiary and the head entity. But does that also maybe add a little bit of a blush that they're really hedging their exposure to Canadian USD and the oil, and not necessarily worrying about really the exposure of the Aussie subsidiary in terms of the AUD exposure per se? They're more concerned about ensuring that the oil which they're marketing and selling from the Australian subsidiary is sheltered from fluctuation between the USD Canadian more so than the USD AUD.
I'm struggling with that, to be honest, because that they haven't got a CAD exposure. That would say that they're hedging US dollars to CAD rather than CAD to US dollars.
Well, I think the point there is that the Canadian entity would have a CAD USD exposure when it sells the oil in USD. Yeah,
well, absolutely. I mean, if it's reporting in CAD and it's getting US dollar revenues, then that's not just limited to their Australian operations. That's everywhere, because customers don't pay for, or the vast majority of customers don't pay for oil and gas in US dollars, in the local currency. They pay for it in US dollars. Or if they are paying it for US dollars or in local currency, you can bet your bottom dollar that there's a clause in the contract that links it back to the US dollar price. I'm struggling to imagine the circumstances of why you would do that.